It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Take Command podcast coming at you early on a Monday morning. So, Logan, have you had your coffee yet? You caffeinated? You ready to go?
You know, Craig, I don't drink coffee. I just get up and, suffer through the day.
I got a spot of tea.
Spot of tea? I do prefer tea to coffee. I don't know why. I don't know. If I were to do one, it'd be tea.
Yeah, I like coffee. It's typically what I drink. I just didn't want to have coffee. I don't know. I felt like my throat was a little dry, so I went with a little tea, a little honey. And let's see how this podcast goes early on a Monday morning.
Right.
So appreciate everybody checking this out wherever it is you're watching or listening. If you haven't started watching the podcast yet, but you keep hearing us talk about it, full episodes are now available on the Odyssey Sports page on YouTube. So make sure that you check us out there. I'll still post a lot of clips on my YouTube page, youtube.com/@CraigHoffman. And we'll also post some on 106.7 The Fans page as well. But Logan, obviously a weird week for us in the podcast. We get in this nice rhythm of review the game, preview the next one, talk about the big issues around the team, and then there's no game. So what did you do with your Sunday? How much football did you watch, and how nice was it to just be able to watch multiple games if that's what you were doing versus focusing on the one?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have cable, so I'm always checking on my phone, the scores and stuff. And I think it's just really interesting, the parity and how certain teams are kind of getting hot at the right time. Certain teams are kind of cooling, like Tennessee. That Tennessee-Jacksonville game I thought was fascinating because Trevor Lawrence seems to have turned a quarter. I think 4 of his last 5 games, he's graded above 85% or 85, whatever that number is at PFF. And it's shown up. He's been very productive. And there's that guy that everyone was talking about as being that generational talent. Sans Urban Meyer, I think, is really interesting. Obviously, Tampa Bay looking like absolute garbage the past couple of weeks, just not able to figure anything out offensively. I think and then Miami seems to be kind of hitting a misstep 2 weeks in a row now, which is interesting. And I know it's just fun to kind of keep track of that stuff, I think. And, looking around the division specifically, obviously Philly, I think watching that Philly game, I know we're going to talk about it more in a couple of days, but the Philly Giants game I thought was really interesting because it shows you how good Philly is. And honestly, just the margin for error when you're playing a ball control style offense like the Commanders play, because the Commanders in our first outing were 1 or 2 big plays away from having a score look very similar to that, which sounds crazy, but when you watch the game flow was very similar. Obviously the Cowboys almost losing to Houston was pretty wild considering how bad Houston's roster is. But it just shows you every week, man, you got to come, put your mouthpiece in, buckle your helmet up and go get it. So I like that. I know a lot of fans don't like that there's not a juggernaut in the NFL at the moment, but I like that it's scrappy and it's tough. And, I enjoy that.
Yeah, I mean, the Chiefs and Broncos finally get some offense going,
Yeah.
But Chiefs ultimately pull that one out. The Buccaneers thing is wild because now you've got in the NFC South literally no one that should be in the playoffs. Should I feel like with the new 17-game schedule, I was thinking about this last night, this is going to sound like a wacky idea, radio guy with the wacky idea, but shouldn't you have to win 8 games to get in the playoffs? If you can't finish 8 and 9, do you belong in the playoffs? Well, you got Tampa at 6 and 7 at the top of that division. And Carolina is 1 game out. The Panthers don't belong in the playoffs this year.
I mean, the one team
in what world do they belong in? Are you going that team should be allowed to compete for a championship? And frankly, the Buccaneers at this point are like that too. If you can't, in a 17-game schedule, if you can't win, and I know it's supposed to be by division and what if you get a really tough division where teams knock down, drag out, fighting each other? You can't get to 8.
Right.
Come on.
Yeah, I think
it's awful.
Yeah, but again, Carolina is kind of getting sneaky hot right now, and
they figured
Seattle
some things out,
cooling down. So, I just think back to that Seattle game against New Orleans a couple years ago when they were 8-8 or whatever they were.
They were 7-9.
7-9, and they beat New Orleans. So it just the matchup, the home game advantage, all that kind of stuff. I know Atlanta didn't play this weekend, but is Desmond Ridder going to start for them the remainder of the season?
That's the plan, which is hilarious because they're a game out of the division at 5-8, and they said as long as we're in it, we're going to keep riding with Mariota, and they are going to go to Desmond Ridder after the bye.
I think that's a really smart move, though. I think because like after watching, I thought because like I fell in love with Atlanta after watching them against us because I'm like, this is a team that knows who they are, and if they can get a passer who can complete passes, they're going to be pretty dang good. So like I watched their game last week, and I was like, man, if they can complete, 5 more passes in this game, they easily win. So I'm sure. Arthur Smith is a smart guy. He's probably looking at that roster saying, man, like we're actually not that far off if our quarterback can play a little bit better. He did a little zone read in college, not the same way Mariota did. But, and then you look at Houston with a 2-quarterback system. Maybe you can deploy something like that, like have Mariota have his package. And you know what I'm saying? So, like, I don't know. I think that's a smart move. And it'd be really interesting to see if they can make a push because I really like that team right now. And I think they're way closer than people think. So
I think what's really wild is you kind of scroll through the divisions, like some of these teams that just don't make sense record-wise this year. It's one of the, like I'm sure statisticians will study the 2022 and like economists and people who look at, expected performance type of things. Because like in the AFC East, every team has a positive point differential. Every
AFC
single team.
East.
The Bills are plus 132 points for versus points against on the year. The Dolphins are plus 4. Then you have the Jets plus 21, and the Patriots who play tonight currently sit at plus 23. The Ravens and the Bengals in the AFC North are above. The Browns and Steelers are below. Like that's what a division theoretically is supposed to look like.
Yeah.
But then the Titans in the AFC South they're 7-6, over 500, leading the division at a minus 35 on the year.
Oh my gosh!
The Jaguars have now pulled even; they're at 0, and then the Colts and Texans are obviously well under. And then the NFC North, there are 3 teams that are under on point differential, and 1 team that is over. The team that is over is not the 10-3 Minnesota Vikings. They are actually under on the year by a point because they've won games by such a slim margin, and they've gotten blown out now a couple of times, including by the Lions yesterday. And the Lions at 6-7 are plus 2 on the year. The entire NFC South is at least minus 24 point differential. The best point differential in the division is the Falcons at minus 24. And then everyone else is floating around minus 30, minus 32. So you just have like these entire divisions that by point differential, which is typically a pretty predictive stat, and like a good stat to measure how good a team really is. I mean, for instance, the Bills and the Niners are far and away the best 2 teams in the league this year in that stat. Like you have 2 entire divisions that are minus in point differential on the year. It's bananas. And another one that would be if the Jags weren't 0 even.
Yeah.
So it's truly wild in terms of the parity in the NFL, but it's not like it is parity week in and week out. It is parity where, any team could win on any given Sunday against any other team, but it also is kind of divided where you have a couple of divisions like the AFC and NFC East that seem to be having great years as entire divisions, and these other divisions where it's anybody's game because nobody's actually that good.
Yeah, and I think that shows itself. I mean, like when you watch Minnesota play, you're not like, man, this team is really good. They're not like the Bills or the Chiefs or Philly. They're like in a different tier. And I think a little bit of that is expressed in that metric you just mentioned, right? Because they're never blowing teams out. They're never in a dominant way. The defense isn't outstanding. They have good players, no doubt, but like they're giving up a ton of yards. Kirk is having his like worst statistical year, I think, it's like since his rookie year or since his 3rd year in the league. So obviously like that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that's a really interesting statistic. And I think, again, that feels right, and for San Francisco to be, again, one of those top tier teams, I think you feel that. And it's interesting because obviously the Commanders play them coming up. And I think you see how good they are offensively. You see all the weapons they have. I mean, Brock Purdy's their quarterback. And I like Brock Purdy a lot coming out. I thought he'd be like a good rotational kind of high-end backup type guy in the NFL. But obviously Kyle's elevates him, and like you don't really feel like you're even missing a beat without Jimmy Garoppolo. So I don't know. It's a lot of fun to watch, and how about that game with Kansas City? Like Holmes throws 3 interceptions and like it gets all crazy. You know what I mean? So it's I don't know. It's fun, man. I really enjoy this. That you kind of when we're doing our pick'ems or when I do my pick'ems for the Fox 5 show on Sunday, like I don't really know. I don't have like a confident thing. It's a lot of like this team seems like they're getting hot. This is a good matchup for them, and you kind of make your picks that way, which is a little bit unusual outside of how I would normally do it. And I think that is, again, indicative of this parity, this kind of unusual statistical year like you just referenced.
Yeah, it is a really bizarre year. And teams that have also, the last like kind of big picture thing I want to talk about real quick before we move on to a couple more of your Commanders questions. And obviously we will get into some of the defense in terms of a self-scout as promised on the pod. But you have so many teams that have turned their fortunes mid-year. And the Commanders certainly fit into that mold. But if you talk about teams like, I mean, Tennessee's going a little bit the wrong direction.
Right.
They've now lost 3 in a row. But Jacksonville, they've been a little bit more up and down steady, but have turned it on more as of late. The Raiders, I mean, well, the crazy thing about the Raiders is they really turned it around because weren't they the last team to get a win?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden pulled themselves to 5-7. And then they lose on Thursday Night Football on a 98-yard drive to Baker Mayfield and the Rams. Right. Baker Mayfield and the Rams, a sentence that literally did not exist a week ago. And then you've got Washington, who obviously started 2-4 and has turned it around to be 7-5. Detroit also really struggled for a while there. The Commanders were the only team that they had beaten, and now they're 6-7 on the verge of a playoff spot. So it really is wild how some of these teams have been. Carolina fired Matt Rule and is turned it around to 5-8, and they're suddenly in the mix in the NFC South because the NFC South is terrible. But it is really interesting how some of these, like, it feels like more teams than usual, I would say, have like completely turned it around. And some of them, in a sense, I feel like we saw coming. Like, I don't think people thought Washington was that bad. Mm-hmm. People certainly thought, I mean, part of this was the Hard Knocks thing, but like, people certainly thought Detroit was posed to do some damage. And even if you watch their games earlier in the season, you're like, man, they're good offensively. If they can stop being abysmal defensively, they could win some games. And sure enough, that's what happens.
And I think,
what's happened, I should say.
Yeah, and I just think, like, we talked about this before in the show. Like, that's one of the reasons I don't take a ton of stock in the first quarter of the season. Like, when I'm watching NFL football, the first quarter, like, it kind of lays a foundation for who you think teams are. But really, teams don't become who they are until that second or third quarter of the year, and teams can kind of change their identity, and that has been hashed out perfectly this year. Like, I look at Seattle, I look at Tennessee, I look at some of these teams that are the Giants, right, who came out like gangbusters, looking like they were going to take the league by storm, and they've cooled a little bit. So I think, obviously, like, you know, when Vegas puts out that win total at the beginning of the year, like, Vegas is not dumb. They know what they're doing, right? And so right now I see the Commanders sitting at their 7-win total, which is what Vegas picked at the beginning of the year. And hopefully they can outperform that, but it's only going to be just, you know, and I think a lot of these other teams are kind of coming back to average a little bit. So, it is interesting how this kind of, like, midpoint of the year has been a tipping point. I like how you mentioned Jacksonville, how they've kind of found something seemingly, and they're beating, you know, apparently good football teams. So, it's awesome to watch each week. I mean, this week it was also kind of weird because there was like a whole bunch of teams on bye. There was like 6 teams on bye week, so there wasn't a lot of football going on. So I felt like half the league moved forward or backward, and then the other half was just kind of chilling. But yeah, man, it's a lot of fun to talk about, and I think it makes for good watching every Sunday, I think.
Yeah. So as it stands right now, which this should not change based off of Monday Night Football tonight, because the Cardinals are not going to enter this equation. I mean, they could enter like the next group of teams, but where the Commanders are, it won't affect them. Commanders currently sit 6th, so they are firmly in the playoffs right now, thanks to losses by New York and Seattle. Commanders entered the weekend in 8th out of the playoffs, but thanks to tiebreakers and the tie, where Seattle 7-6, Washington and New York are 7-5-1. Washington wins the tiebreaker over New York based on win percentage in division games. They would currently sit 6th, which would get them a date with the San Francisco 49ers. Yikes. So that's not ideal. And that's also kind of the wacky thing this year. They would get. Would they get the Niners? Yeah, they would.
It was Minnesota for a while, but
yeah, the Giants would get Minnesota, and Dallas would get Tampa.
Oh man!
So, you know, depending on how this thing goes, you know, you almost might wind up being better 7th than 6th. But obviously, right now the whole goal is to get in, and then you go from there. But the Niners are on the schedule coming up on Christmas Eve, so you could wind up, whether it's Minnesota or San Francisco, you're going to wind up facing a team that you've already faced this year. So that could be a super interesting one. If it's Minnesota, I mean, that could be a big time revenge game, because it's one that the Commanders, Ron talked about, like that one really ate him up. So, that's going to be a fun storyline to watch. The seeding, and obviously whether or not they get in as we roll down the stretch. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. I'm Craig Hoffman. That is Logan Paulson. All right, Logan. Let's take a look at the defense. I got one question I want to get to from someone who shot me a note on Twitter. But first, let's just overarching, you think about the defense, how it's developed this year. Big thoughts on the defense in the mode of a self-scout and how this team has come together.
Yeah, I think, big picture thoughts. I think schematically, I think they've kind of all started buying into what Jack Del Rio wants to do. I think obviously the defensive line is the strength of the team. And then, they've gotten better production growth, I would say, from the linebacker unit in terms of Jamin Davis, because they really only play one linebacker consistently at this point, and it's Jamin. He's done a nice job. I think he's slow the last couple of weeks, but I just found out that he had a pretty significant injury and is kind of nursing that. So that kind of makes more sense to me. And then I think the back end development and kind of the musical chairs in terms of finding where people sit has been extremely instrumental. Like getting William Jackson III out, Benjamin St. Juste in, huge. The emergence of Derek Forrest, I think, has been really nice, just in terms of a guy who understands the system, plays physical, aggressive football. Kam Curl, obviously one of the best safeties in the NFL by grade, and I think that hashes it out each week. And then Kendall Fuller, people I think were very critical of him early on, and over the last 5 games, he's done excellent. He's been fantastic, and a little bit of that strength of schedule, strength of opponent. But I think that's also what you get when Benjamin St. Juste can do some of that heavy lifting for you and take some of those tougher matchups. You put him in a better spot to be successful. And then Bobby McCain moving to nickel has been, again, a huge asset in terms of just kind of allocating resources in the secondary. So I think if I was going to say one thing that was kind of unexpected, was I kind of expected Jamin to develop. I don't think I expected him to develop this much, but the secondary and the pieces that have come through there, St. Juste, Derek Forrest, like you've gotten 2 excellent starters. Excellent. I feel very comfortable saying that. And guys that understand the scheme, understand what Jack wants. And then, that's awesome. And then I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about how the chemistry of the defensive line, like last year, that was much maligned. They're not working together, all this stuff. And this year, in the run game and the pass game, they just understand each other really well and understand where to fit in and play off of each other. And they've just obviously been one of the most dynamic groups in the NFL. So I do think, like, on a smaller scale, they've kind of struggled a little bit the last couple of weeks, struggled for them. They haven't looked quite as dominant, quite as assertive. And I think the bye comes at a really good time for them. Hopefully you get Benjamin St. Juste back. Hopefully Jamin gets healthy in this bye week, and then they can kind of make, and John's always kind of banged up. Then you kind of make this push for the last 4 games.
Yeah. Someone asked me, actually it was, speaking of Derek Forrest, different Derek Forrest, the Derek Forrest who hosts the sports on DC News Now. So I was doing TV with him on Friday, and he goes, "Who's the defensive MVP?" He actually asked me both, offensive and defensive. Offensive is hard, man, because there's not like, I guess I went with Terry kind of by default.
I'd say either that Terry or Brian Robinson, I would say, would be the one I would say, just because he kind of embodies your offensive philosophy. Yeah, but Terry for sure would be great.
Terry, I think it's just kind of on the most outstanding kind of it, almost gets it by default. But anyway, defensively, I said, Allen and Payne are the obvious choices, and none of this happens without them. And so by nature, they are most valuable. But if we were to try to pick someone who wasn't them, Kam Curl, to me, is the guy that comes in and completely changes their – I mean, even when Jackson was there, things started to turn some and like solidify, and then you had the William Jackson adjacent coverage busts. But like the rest of the defense started to turn and get better when Kam Curl came back, because he missed those first 2 games against Jacksonville where, you're a couple of Trevor Lawrence easy misses away from a disastrous kind of day. Detroit, where you have a disastrous kind of day. And then if you were to have Kam Curl in those games, who knows what the record looks like? I mean, I guess they went 1-1 in those games anyway. But statistically, as they, still float lower than you'd think in some statistical categories because they had those first couple of games that were out of character based off the rest of their season. Like Kam Curl has been incredible all season long, and he's made up for he's made up for the loss of Cole in a lot of ways, which actually brings us to our question. Someone asked, and I promised them I would get it on the last pod, and then we wound up going super long on a bunch of offensive topics, so I apologize. And I said it's at the top of my list for this one. So here we are, first question of the podcast that's not coming from me, and here is your question. But how have the Commanders missed Cole Holcomb, and how big of a deal is it that he is gone for the rest of the year?
I mean, I think it's a huge deal. Before the injury became like, oh, he's done for the year, I thought, oh, after the bye, he'll be able to come back, and I really think it adds value because he's not like I have to make highlights for players for segments on the show that I do, the Command Center show, and it's not like he's making all these crazy splash plays, but playing middle linebacker is very, very challenging, because you are kind of in the middle of the formation. You can get double teams from both sides. They can attack the perimeter both sides. And then that's the level of the defense where you want to attack is that middle linebacker spot, right? Because they have to step up on run. They have to step up to the fullback, and there's a big void behind them. So very, very challenging. And I will say what Cole does an excellent job of is he's very, very just consistent. He's very, very, he's going to make the tackle. He's going to get guys lined up. And I think just having that kind of centering presence there at middle linebacker is big for not only the defense as a whole, but a guy like Jamin who can kind of bump outside and play that edge spot, and then getting guys lined up. And it just he's the brain of the defense, right? And I think Jamin deserves a ton of credit because he's played really well in his absence. But I think the whole defense just elevates a little bit, when he's in the lineup. And I think it's not necessarily what you're going to see from a statistical perspective, but it's more like the emotional kind of calming presence that he brings, and then the consistency of his play, like not overly flashy, but just uber consistent. Because I think if you watch Jamin by comparison, Jamin makes so many splash plays, like he's running sideline to sideline, he's blowing up guards, and you see this tremendous physical ability. But in addition to the high ceiling of Jamin, you also see the floor, right, where he kind of makes mental mistakes. He's not in the right position all the time. And Cole, his floor is so high because he knows what he's doing. He knows where he fits, and he's also a great athlete. So I do think not having him back I'm disappointed, honestly, because I like this defense with him there. But I think you bring up a really valid point in that Kam Curl is also kind of that calming presence, or he has been in Cole's absence. And, Damon's got the green dot now. That's been really cool to see a young player kind of step into that role. But I do think Kam and, Bobby deserves a lot of credit too. Like when you watch the film, Kam, Bobby, Forrest, all three of those, it's really the chemistry of those three guys as opposed to just Kam being back that elevates the defense, right? Because they communicate really well. They play off each other. They know how to disguise stuff. So there was a tackle for loss in the New York Giants game, right, where Bobby's kind of backing up, like in a quarter shell. He's standing right behind Kam, who looks like he's playing man-to-man coverage on the receiver. And then they just kind of perfectly time up the rotation. Kam blitzes and is able to get a tackle for a loss. And I think that you don't get that just by Kam being back. You get that by Bobby understanding how Kam does it, right? And Forrest understanding that this is I can hold it till right now because Bobby's going to hold it till right now. So, I think that's again, it's really disappointing to me that Cole's not going to be back because I think of that calming presence. But I think those three guys in the back end and their relationship together kind of offsets some of that, I guess.
Right. So the other thing that I think they miss specific to their schedule, if you will, with Cole is the speed that he brings compared to his replacements, right? Because Bostic...
You're talking about Bostic and Mayo.
Yeah. Bostic and Mayo are both super intelligent players. And they can try to be in the right spots, but they're not going to get there as quickly. And it also means when plays get out of structure and there is no quote-unquote right spot and it's time to go make a play, they're not as effective. Right. And Cole is a guy who can go chase down Jalen Hurts or Daniel Jones or now Brock Purdy or who pick your running quarterback who they faced a lot of, because that is the guys playing quarterback in the league now often have that element of mobility to their game. And you think of the Philly game where, oh my God, Jalen was about to go out and run and Jamin or Cole goes and chases him down. Or some of the games earlier this year where we saw similar things where we were really concerned about a scrambling quarterback, and those two guys were able to shut that down because they could keep eyes on the quarterback in a zone and then go run and get there before the quarterback picked up the first down. We talked about how valuable scrambles are because they often come in like situations where you need a first down, third downs, and they often achieve that, right? Well, if you take off to run and don't get the first down, well, that would then be equally valuable going back the other way. And Cole's speed and his presence, which frees up Jamin to do even more, I think is something they've missed specifically in that New York game. Specifically, they missed it against Jones, who was able to pick up some of those. And I think of the play where everybody over pursues and then Jones scrambles back up the middle, and John Bostic's chasing him and eventually catches him, but how much quicker does Cole catch him? And those are the things where, like, that's pretty simple analysis because it's just like, hey, the faster guy would have gotten there faster. Right. But, like, that also does matter in a league where scrambles and mobility for quarterbacks have immense value. And Cole is the kind of guy, because he is a 4.4 player. That's what he ran at his pro day. Right. He wasn't invited to the combine, something he would happily remind you of. But at his pro day when he ran a 4.4, like that's the kind of athlete that he is. And he also obviously sees it pretty quickly as well. We talked about the mental side of it, but I think that's where they've missed him. And it's going to be interesting to watch again, them matching up against New York this weekend, as well as a guy like Dak Prescott, even in the final week of the season. If Dak's playing at that point, anybody that can scramble, it becomes a huge factor.
Deshaun Watson, there's a ton of guys, right? I don't disagree with that. I also think he's got like this like certain like je ne sais quoi, that certain like it factor, right? That certain element, right? Like he's grown up. Like like when I first started covering the team, like he wasn't overly dynamic, and I think he's just evolved from an intellectual standpoint, from a feel standpoint, and has gotten to this point where he's like a serviceable starting middle linebacker. And I say serviceable like as a positive, right? Because I think there's a lot of times people, they get bad middle linebacker play, and he's not one of those guys. So I do think that's big. I think, one of the things Jack's done to kind of mitigate that is kind of going to your guy, Kam Curl, in these big nickel Cinco situations. And I think the more you can do that, the better. But, when you do that, you got to make sure that you trust Bobby, you trust Forrest, and then Percy Butler has been a guy that they've tried to bring in rotational elements a little bit. So, like that stresses you in a different way. And if Cole's there, you're less stressed. But I think they've done a good job of kind of getting by without him, but I just think the defense becomes more complete with him there. And that's not an indictment of Jamin, because I think he's done an excellent job. He's playing really, really good football, and the defense as a whole is playing well, but I just think it gives you a little bit more margin for error, if he's in the lineup. And so obviously it's too bad that he's going to miss the year, and I'm not sure when his contract's up, but
he's a free agent this offseason. I
would imagine this would affect that pretty dramatically. So that's kind of a bummer for him, because I'm not sure you bring him back. I think you want to. I think that's something that. Well,
that's actually something I was about to ask you. Is Jamin has the green dot. Is he playing Mike, or is he still playing Will?
So it's interesting. He does play Mike in certain situations, but like on the goal line, for example, against not the goal line, but like they were at the 5 or the 6 yard line versus the New York Giants. Kam is playing what essentially amounts to like a middle linebacker spot, and Bobby is playing what amounts to the Sam, and Jamin is playing the Will, just by alignment, right? Mm-hmm. So they've kind of, worked in ways to keep Jamin roughly in his same spot, and obviously, like, kudos to Kam to be able to like come in and do that, and Forrest also kind of getting in that Sam linebacker, extra safety in the box type of role. And so they've done both. He's played middle linebacker mostly on first and second down, but then, they'll sprinkle in these one where he's obviously the Will and Bostic's the Mike, or he's the Will and Cam's kind of that pseudo Mike type player. So, that's been an interesting kind of development, I think.
Yeah. And so that'll obviously affect. The reason I ask on the heels of the Cole question is like, when you think about whether or not to bring Cole Holcomb back, like, do you trust Jamin to play middle linebacker in year 3 full time? And is that his highest and best use? And, I guess we'll find out this offseason, depending on what they do. I mean, it also depends on who's making the decision. Just, and obviously I think Jack at this point is wanted back in a way that maybe he wasn't earlier in the season, but does Jack want to come back? That was something that was, very heavily rumored. It was like, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. It's his last year anyway. Like, he doesn't even want to come back. We'll see. But in going into the offseason and what whoever is in place is looking to do. The last thing I'll just say real quick on the defense, there's no question the guy that, with all due respect to Cole, the guy they need back right now is Benjamin St. Juste.
100%.
That is, Derek Forrest on DC News Now asked me, like, what's the biggest surprise of the season? And like, that one was easy. Offensive and defensive MVP are kind of hard. Biggest surprise, St. Juste, since he's been outside, has been incredible. And you saw the difference on Sunday without him against the Giants team, by the way, that doesn't have a lot of weaponry. But all of a sudden you get against, San Francisco in a couple weeks where Ayuk's out there running around and McCaffrey's out there running around. And, hopefully we get great news on Deebo Samuel and that he's not done for the season with the injury that he suffered yesterday. There were some early reports that he had avoided major injury. But obviously they've got to run tests and whatever today. But regardless, like, they've got to get St. Juste back, and it is a reminder of how thin they are in the secondary, that they cannot afford to lose Fuller or St. Juste, because otherwise they are dancing, skating, whatever, on the thinnest of ice.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true, and I'm glad you mentioned Fuller, because if either one of those guys has any type of injury where they have to miss time, like, I think Christian Holmes is a good football player. I think he's done a great job on special teams. And I think he's got some physical tools that get you excited for his upside. But he has not played great in his time as the starter, right? And I think he's a young football player that's to be expected. But, Danny Johnson's done a good job stepping in spot duty. But he's not Kendall Fuller and he's not Benjamin St. Juste. So, and there's a reason that they have moved Bobby McCain to nickel, right, is because they are – I don't want to say they doubt him as a coverage player. I think they have a lot of faith in him. But I think they feel like Bobby was doing a better job, and I think Bobby has done a better job. So, you really have two starting caliber corners than everybody else who's kind of a rotational special teams type of piece, and it really makes it tough, I think, to walk that margin of error. And again, in terms of roster construction, everyone says, "Ooh, look at where they're at, look at the defense." But this is one of those things in the offseason where you're kind of like, everyone was kind of wringing their hands about secondary depth, and I here is showing you why. And obviously, they traded William Jackson III, and I think that affects this in a pretty dramatic way. But it is just the margin for error is just very, very small with that group, and in terms of health. And, football is a physical game. There's a lot of stuff that just pops up, and, like they can, I don't want to say they can't win football games, but they can't beat good teams without both those guys out there. And that's really what the score comes down to. Yeah,
definitely. And they've got obviously good teams left on their schedule. And when you get to the playoffs, Logan, there's
good football teams.
There's allegedly good teams there. I know. It's crazy how that works. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. I'm Craig Hoffman. That is Logan Paulson. You can catch me weekday afternoons on the Hoffman Show on the Team 980. Catch Logan on Command Center on the Commanders YouTube page, and you can catch both of us I guess not Sunday at 10 a.m. For Countdown to Kickoff, before kickoff on Countdown to Kickoff, because we are going to be, I believe, 6 o'clock to 8:20 on Sunday, because they got Sunday Night Football coming up. By the way, we actually haven't talked about that, so let's try to squeeze two things in here real quick in the next 10 minutes before this podcast is over. One, how big of a deal is it that this is Sunday Night Football, then going into Saturday football across the country, San Francisco? Like, some people have made a pretty big deal out of it, including, by the way, Ron Rivera's pretty ticked off about it. Yeah. How big of a deal is that as a player to try to, first of all, just the difference between a Sunday 1 o'clock and a Sunday night? I know how different it was as a reporter, and I didn't recover well, and I didn't have to play a snap. And then the West Coast trip, day early, the whole thing.
So just to give you like logistically, right? So obviously you're not going to finish the game until 11 o'clock, right? And you want to start your prep, I don't want to say immediately, but pretty close after the game, not for not even to review the film, but kind of want to get started on San Francisco, that film won't be up till probably 1:30, 2 a.m., right? So you kind of lose that post-game prep time, which is, a couple hours, but it's significant, right? Because you got to get your install ready for Tuesday, right? And on a short week, that might even be Monday. So in terms of work week schedule with the trip, it is a big deal. It's going to be tough to get those guys back to 100%. They're probably just going to go – they're probably in a straight walkthrough mode already. I think it helps coming off the bye. And if you're smart, if you're Ron, you kind of say, let's start prepping some San Francisco stuff this week because we just saw the Giants. So if we can get kind of that foundation laid so we don't have to kind of be scrambling to prep post
so
Giants
you're talking
game.
about as a coaching staff or with the players?
The coaching staff. I'm saying the coaching staff, they need to prep that. That needs to be prepped so that they can just kind of come in on Monday and be like, hey, this is the cover 3 package for San Francisco. Obviously, we're still finalizing.
Would you have just basically taken the bye week and be like, guys, we don't have a bye week. We have San Francisco prep week, and then we're going to go back into Giants mode and then go back into San Francisco mode? Because in that way, it kind of would, I guess, work out. Thank God for the bye.
Yeah, so, that's kind of how maybe not that the structure is irrelevant. It just is like we're going to prep for the Giants, and then, we're going to prep for the Giants for 5 hours a day. And then for the last 3 hours, let's make sure we're starting to lay the foundation for San Francisco from a coaching standpoint. And so you just have all the cut-ups ready. You have all that stuff ready so you can kind of accelerate that process. So in a way, it is good for the bye, but it does make the bye less enjoyable for the coaching staff, I think, which is probably one of Ron's frustrations. And also the recovery. That trip to San Francisco is a nightmare. I never went to San Francisco when I played here, but I did go to Seattle. It's a beast of a trip, right? Because it's a long flight. There's a big time change. You're playing really early in the day, kind of for your body clock, and then the trip back is tough, right? Because you don't get back until way later in the evening. So it's a tough trip, and it's against a good opponent. I think one of the reasons Ron's probably frustrated, or I'm assuming he's frustrated, is because San Francisco is the better team, right? So you want as much time to get ready for them as possible. So I think it is a big deal. But ultimately, no one cares, right? No one cares because you got to do it.
The win-loss record doesn't care. It's going to be a win or a loss, and it will go, or a tie, as we found out, and it's going to go in that column. I think the other thing, just from like a physical standpoint, you talk about the recovery. Like, sleep is the most important recovery tool you have, and when you are juiced up after a Sunday night game, win or loss or tie, it's going to be hard to go to bed, and that's your first night of recovery. So instead of finishing a game at 4 o'clock, getting home by 6:30, having a good dinner, getting nutrition in, and then getting a good night's sleep, you are trying to get home as fast as possible after finishing a game at 11. Anyone that's gone, remember, players all live in like Ashburn, Northern Virginia area. You're going from Landover. Like, you're not going to be eating a full meal at 11 o'clock at night.
And like you said, you're up. Like, right. It's really hard to come down from a game. So I remember doing these like primetime games, so Monday night, Thursday Sunday night, and not really being able to go to sleep until like 3 a.m. because you're just up. And I talked to Chad about this, actually, kind of to your point, from a recovery side, and he was like, it's a nightmare, man, because no one went to sleep. No one ate food. So, thank God coach has done a good job this year of pushing back start times on Monday. But it's like, we can't do anything physical. It's like pretty much like warm up, stretch, roll out, recovery in the building, and then to the next thing.
Like, walk through maybe.
Yeah.
But even then, you're not mentally as sharp.
Right.
Like, Monday becomes a wasted day. And it's one thing to have Monday on a wasted day. It's worth it. It's Sunday Night Football, whatever, when you've got a full week. But to have it on to go to Saturday, that's a rough gig. All right. We got five minutes or so left in the podcast. And this is a question we could do an entire podcast on. But let's just kind of try to scratch the surface of it real quick. And this one's from Morgan. Send it to you on Instagram. Should we consider going all in on Kyler Murray next year? Something a bit smaller than what the Broncos paid for Russ. He continued and says, there's always a team that, like the Rams 2 years ago, that is seemingly a quarterback away from seriously contending, and it's damn near negligent for a said team to keep rolling out mediocre to bad quarterbacks. Kyler is really the only good young quarterback that might be available, and he's on a manageable contract for the next few years. Why not go all in on a guy like that? Okay, I'm going to editorialize a little bit. One, we do not know that Kyler Murray is going to be available.
Yeah.
He just this past offseason signed an extension. And when he says it's a manageable contract, I guess, but it's also the non-Deshaun Watson absolute everyone hates the Browns for signing that contract, even if it wasn't given to the worst person in the NFL.
Right.
That's still a monster contract. But I mean, then again, that's what quarterbacks cost. So that is what it is. But and then the last part I would say too is setting. I'm now leading you a little bit in the answer, but I guess I get to answer too.
Lead
It's
away.
like,
You're hosting too, or you're hosting and analyst. It's a tough gig, Craig.
The Rams made the Super Bowl with Jared Goff.
Yeah.
So the Commanders, while they didn't win it until they got Matt Stafford, they did make the Super Bowl with Jared Goff. So let's see what the Commanders do with Taylor Heineke this year, certainly. And Goff is better than Heineke. But it's not like you're 100% at that level. That said, I think the premise of the question is super interesting because they do have a fantastic defense. They do have really good skill position players. There's some other holes in the team, but I guess the crux of the question really is, Logan, how aggressive should Washington be at this point going after any veteran quarterback that might be available in a trade, or even, I will add to the question and say, giving up resources to move up in the draft and take someone they like in the top 10, let's say?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I mean, that is the question when you're building a team, right? Is like, how do you get your quarterback? And that's been Ron's question. That's everybody's asking that all the time. And in response to the question, I would say it really depends on how close you think this roster actually is. And then when you are giving up financial resources and when you're giving up draft capital, you're basically saying like, we're ready right now. And I would say that this team is not ready right now for a couple of reasons. So let's just talk about one of the most significant issues, I think, which is the offensive line. When you are bringing in a good quarterback, you need good offensive line play. And if you look at Kansas City, you look at the Bills, you look at Philly, right? I mean, those are probably three of the best offensive lines in the NFL, like pass protection and run blocking. They just get dogs. And, it's not all the top end talent, like Buffalo, their right tackle was like a 5th round pick who's grown up, right? Kansas City, Trey Smith was a 5th round pick, obviously for medical reasons, all that kind of stuff. But they've cultivated a roster that can support the quarterback position and support this tiered offense in terms of attacking down the field. So I would say they don't need to go out and spend a ton of money, but they definitely need to find a way to invest resources there. If you're paying the quarterback, free agency is essentially off the table, in my opinion. Right? You can't go out and say, oh, let's go sign the best or even like a top 10 free agent right tackle or right guard or whatever the position is, right? So that's a factor. And I think and I would like them, again, you can do that in the draft. Last year would have been a good year because it was super tackle heavy, dense. And I'm sure you can find guys in this year's draft, but again, that's tough. You got to really comb through and make that happen.
And then they're rookies. I mean, that's even if you find someone who you really like and is going to be an all-pro player, unless they come in and they're awesome from day one, you're still dealing with a rookie if you're talking about winning right now.
And if you're trading draft capital, either to move up or as a package for this player that you want to trade for, Kyler Murray in this example, Lamar Jackson maybe, you are losing the opportunity to kind of get that blue chip player at the top of the draft. So I think I would say from that standpoint, the roster doesn't feel ready to me. It doesn't feel ready to make that type of move. And then you got to look at defensively. And, Daron Payne is having one of the most outstanding years for a defensive tackle ever. He is going to be very hard to re-sign if you pay a lot of money to a quarterback. So how does that degrade your defense immediately? It impacts your ability to re-sign Montez Sweat. All of those things become impacted, right? When Jamin comes up, how can you re-sign him? And the defense right now is carrying the team. And it seems weird to kind of parcel that out. You're probably trading a defensive player to get Kyler Murray here. Yeah. So
you're saying goodbye to Montez Sweat.
Probably. Yeah, probably. And again, so without those pieces, does Kyler Murray or Lamar Jackson or insert whoever you want here, do they bring enough value add to this roster as it is right now? And I think looking at LA, for example, just because that was the example given, like they will be suffering the consequences of trading for Matt Stafford for a couple of years. They just don't have any depth on the roster, right? They have a couple of very, very good football players, Bobby Wagner, Jalen Ramsey, Aaron Donald, and then nobody else. And I think when you look at their offensive line as a good kind of juxtaposition with the Commanders, they have the worst rated offensive line in the NFL. Their offense is non-tenable. They have skill position players who are pretty solid, right? Obviously, Cooper Kupp, Allen Robinson, some kind of Van Jefferson, some pieces like that. But they can't get the football to them because the quarterback's always on his back. So, again, I don't think that this team, this roster in the current iteration for the Commanders is ready for a fire sale to get a quarterback. I think if they could get a young quarterback, that would be ideal. But again, that's super, super challenging. There are a couple this year that I think you feel pretty good about. But the fire sale thing, I think, like look at the Broncos, for example. Last year everyone was saying, you need to get in on the Russell Wilson sweepstakes. The Commanders trying to get in. I was very anti that because I didn't think Russell was playing that well. And obviously, I feel very validated because he hasn't played that well. Yeah. But that franchise they have an albatross around their neck for the next
4 years.
4 years. They can't get out of that contract. They can't bring new talent in. What's that roster going to look like when you can't re-sign those defensive pass rushers? When Patrick
they already traded Bradley Chubb.
Yeah, when Patrick Surtain comes up on contract, can you re-sign him? Probably not. And so I think those are the types of issues you got to look at and say, do we trust that Kyler Murray, which again has been very up and down in his play, he's obviously very, very talented. And it would be awesome from a market standpoint, from a conversation standpoint, to get him here. But can he elevate this roster? And my answer is probably not. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, he could elevate it to a point. He's not going to elevate it to the point of $46 million a year or whatever he's making. That's what you're ultimately asking. This was my thing with Carson Wentz. Would you rather pay Marcus Mariota 12 and get $12 million of quarterback play, or pay Carson Wentz 28 and maybe get 16?
Yeah.
It's a lot of, it's market inefficiency. And Kyler Murray could help elevate a bad offensive line because he runs around like Sonic the Hedgehog. But he also is not so consistently good that it's actually going to be worth it. And so it's elevate it to what? And I don't think that the rest of the roster, to your point, would be able to hold up with the holes it would have because you are using that money to pay Kyler Murray. To that end, if I'm going to give up something for something, I'm willing to give up some capital to go and take a guy I love in the draft. If I'm convinced he's great, then at least you get him for 5 years on pretty good money. You give up some draft capital in order for the right to do that, and you do not know what he is going to be because that's the nature of quarterback prospects. But if you're going to do it, that's the way I would do it. I think the best way is, honestly, just understand it's a bit of a crapshoot and commit to a guy who's pretty talented in the draft, but falls to you, and take that guy. Don't give up anything. And there's always a chance, look, Mahomes was the 10th pick? It wasn't like he was 1 overall. Lamar's 25.
Deshaun Watson.
Watson was a later pick. You have a lot of these guys that kind of get to the middle of the first round.
And they're on better teams. They're on better rosters, and so they play better. I mean, going back even farther, Joe Flacco, Big Ben, they went to good teams. They were later in the draft, right?
Right.
So I do think that there is value there. And then kind of look at what Scott's done this year in terms of insulating Taylor, right? You can insulate a young quarterback with a good defense. This is what Seattle did with Russell Wilson. They took a guy in the 3rd round. He punched up for a couple of years, but the defense and the run game with Marshawn Lynch allowed him to grow. And then when it was time for him to kind of step into his own and own that team, he was able to, and I think there is a world where that is a viable thing. You just got to really trust your second-tier quarterback evaluation because the top guys, I think, are pretty top because they're really good football players, right?
Right.
But when you're going to be picking, which is probably about where they picked last year, maybe a little bit later, so 16, 17 in the draft, whatever it is.
Yeah,
then
they
your
might
second
wind
round,
up at 20. Yeah.
Yeah, then your second round pick, it's shoot, who's going to be there? You can move up and down a little bit, but I do think that I have always preferred that methodology because it gives you more flexibility. You're not kind of selling the farm for one player. Obviously, that works with Peyton Manning. Obviously, that works Matthew Stafford going to LA. And I think a lot of people say, oh, well, what if Matthew Stafford came here? It's not the same result. It's
Right.
Matthew Stafford in Detroit again happening here, right? And so I think when I look at the situation, when I look at the roster, there's still a lot of holes. There's still a lot of. We just mentioned cornerback. Like you need some depth there, right? Do you draft a guy? What do you do there? So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be addressed here, and selling the farm doesn't allow you to do that.
Right. We will do probably entire podcasts on that in the offseason. Hopefully we can get like some GMs and a personnel guy or someone to come on and talk about it as well as our own thoughts on it. But wanted to answer that question because it came in and it was a good and interesting one to throw a specific name at the problem in terms of Kyler Murray as well. All right. Wednesday, we will get into the Philly-New York game a little bit deeper. What can Washington take from what Philadelphia did in their beat down of the Giants? As Giants-Commanders round 2 is coming up on Sunday, and we'll answer some more questions as well. And then Thursday, we'll kind of mix it up this week because we'll do more of our preview on Wednesday.
Okay.
And then Thursday night, 7 o'clock, our plan is to do the live podcast. So we are still planning on doing that. We will tweet out / Instagram out the details once we have them. But our plan as of right now is Thursday night to go live, tape the podcast, and then we'll put it out Friday morning for those of you that can't join us Thursday evening. So make sure that you're subscribed on Odyssey Sports YouTube page if you want to take that in live. And other than that, subscribe, like wherever you're listening or watching right now, and we'll see you Wednesday for Take Command. Thanks for checking out this clip of Take Command. Or maybe it wasn't a clip. Maybe it was the whole thing. You can always get the whole thing. Let's change the graphic. Ready? Boom. Producing on the fly. Bang. Wherever you get your podcasts. And, of course, right here on YouTube. You can also check us out not only at youtube.com / @CraigHoffman, but Logan, the Odyssey Sports page is live soon. That's very exciting.
That'll be fun. I don't care where you subscribe as long as you do subscribe to one of these platforms. That would be very helpful for us.
Yeah, do it. Or Logan's going to come to your house and he's going to be a sift blocker and knock you over.
Yeah, cut the legs out from under you, right?
You can't even do that on the field, but we can do it in real life.